Playing in the early season snow on our last trip was a lot of fun. I got to see what a stock Land Cruiser with lockers front and rear on 33s could do, but the limitations of the tire size and tread type in this kind of terrain became more and more obvious as the snow got deeper, and getting pulled out over and over again isn't something I want to repeat on our next trip out. I recognize that these BFGs are all-terrains, and I was only aired down to around 8 pounds, and I'm sure another set of 33s with a tread type geared to these kinds of conditions would have done better, but the experience solidified for me the need for larger diameter tires with a more aggressive tread pattern. The direction I want to take this build will have me adding heavier items down the road like a bumper, winch, sliders, and other items that will require a suspension upgrade designed to carry the extra load. But for now, I want to see if I can stuff a nearly 37-inch tall tire with the factory suspension. A little bit of work with the cutoff wheel on the inner and outer fenders and the plastic part of the front bumper made it easy to get the 36 13.5 IROKs to clear when turning from lock to lock. But with the coil spring removed and the axle down on the bump stop, I could tell that under any kind of a shock load, the bump stop would deform enough that the inner fender bolts near the top of the fender would just chew up the tire. Since I'm not ready to commit to cutting all of the inner fender out yet, I decided to mock up some bump stop spacers. I started with just aluminum pucks that had a stem size to fit inside the factory hole on the spring bucket. The pucks helped me quickly test how thick of a spacer I'd need to avoid rubbing on the top of the fender. After putting some thought into the design, I came to the conclusion that I wanted a spacer that mounted on the axle so I could easily remove or change it without having to remove the coil spring. In my mind, this should make it easier to have an optimized bump stop spacer as I swap tire sizes and add heavy accessories in the future. To fasten the spacer to the axle, I decided to drill out the hole in the coil spring bracket and install a riv nut. This makes installing and removing the different size spacers really easy when the suspension is at full droop. I'll do a follow-up video to show the final design and installation of the bump stop spacer, but for now I decided to use a raw aluminum spacer so I can run the IROKs on our next snow wheeling trip and verify that the spacer will work. Luckily in the rear, I didn't have to do any fender trimming. The tire started to rub on the top part of the fender when the axle was riding on the bump stop spacer, so I cloned the same style spacer from the front. The hole in the spring pad is off-center on the rear axle, but it aligns with the center of the bump stop spacer, so I drilled out that hole as well and installed a riv nut and spacer. After testing out a few different size spacers front and rear, things seemed to clear and not rub when I played on the gravel pile in the yard. Unfortunately, on the first dry run with the smallest rear spacers, the IROKs grabbed the rear fender flare when I hit a big bump and ripped one of them clean off. After removing all of the fender flares and installing a little taller spacer in the rear, I didn't have any more rubbing issues. Stay tuned for the next snow wheeling video when we put the tires and spacers to the test.